According to popular legend, Winston Churchill once declared that the finest traditions of the British Navy were rum, sodomy, and the lash. Well, to quote Meatloaf, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Tonight, Zach White is in Clover as we welcome Seth Le Jacq, Professor of History at Hunter College, to discuss what happened below decks, in the brig, and in the courtrooms of the Royal Navy. This is Kiss Me Hardy, Queerness in the Royal Navy. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where boy have we got an episode lined up for you to give you a flavor of some of our guest research, articles that we are actually considering for a special installment of our online course that we run, the Legion de Scholar. Our guest articles include Oh My Poor Arse and Buggery's Travels. So you're clearly getting somebody on the show today with a penchant for picking great research topics and pitching them in a frankly peerless way. We are joined by Seth Le Jacq, Assistant Professor of History at Hunter College, who studies medicine, gender, and sexuality, and particularly is interested within those research areas in early modern Europe, European imperialism, and colonialism. His current research focuses on the queer in the Age of Sail, and he's the editor of the historical source collection Sexual and Gender Difference in the British Navy 1690 to 1900, and is currently working on a very desperately needed monograph on exactly the same topic. Hold this space, because Bo, get open the tracker that we have. We are having an episode on that in due course.
Wait. We schedule these things in advance?
In theory, like it's more a set of guidelines, as I kind of intimated during our episode on piracy during this period, which will actually feature much later than this one goes out. Seth, hello. Sorry for that waffly and rambling intro. Lovely to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Hello. Thank you for having me. What an introduction. I loved that. I'm going to need to bring you to academic conferences in the future.
Well, I think the kudos goes to the Bo for Kiss Me Hardy. That was that was inspired. I suspect some of us might decide, we might even have a fight over who's going to steal that for their next conference paper title. Where to begin with this? I think the state of the field is probably the important starting point with this, because my sense is that there has been some significant progress in recent years in the field of things like attitudes to homosexuality across society. And I'm interested in terms of what used to be the sort of standard interpretation of how those accused or suspected of homosexuality were treated by society, and where we've got to, and we'll get to sort of where we've got to more recently. I'm thinking about the work of people like Eamon O'Keefe in terms of that second part. But in terms of sort of 20 years ago, what would you say was the consensus in terms of how people thought about the receptions to queerness in the 18th and 19th century?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you're right. The field, the literature in the field has evolved a lot recently, and there's a lot of fascinating new work, including Eamon's. The earlier literature, the earlier scholarly interpretations, and the kind of body of scholarship that built up in the wake of the gay rights movement, developing after Stonewall in this country, after partial decriminalization following the Wolfenden Report in Britain, focused a lot on policing, on punishment, a lot of focus on stigma, on negative attitudes. And that makes a lot of sense. The people who were writing that, the historians of that generation, were facing versions of that stigma in their own lives. They were interested in their own time periods and influenced by that, of course. And many of the records that we have about people in the past who had the wrong kinds of sex, what was officially outlawed, also who acted in gendered ways that were considered inappropriate are focused on policing and punishment. And in particular, we have a lot of records of court cases. The history is really fascinating. The In Britain, in England, under English criminal law, sex between men was made illegal. It was made a crime in criminal law under Henry VIII. Those laws actually weren't enforced that frequently until around the year 1700. But then we see this relatively big spike. It's not that many trials, but compared to earlier, a relatively big spike in trials. And so, to these earlier generations of historians, this looked like a really severe crackdown. And the punishments were also quite severe. So, men could be put in the pillory for misdemeanor sex crimes, and it was a hanging crime, a mandatory hanging crime if you're convicted of the felony. And so, there is a long tradition of seeing um, those trials, that reaction from the justice system, as symptomatic of this intense homophobia and a real hatred of sex between men in particular. But the more recent research has revised that and put those kinds of punishments, that kind of policing, into a broader context and helped us understand it in a more nuanced way, I would say. So it's not that that earlier research is incorrect, but I think that the focal point there, looking in particular at the pillory, um, at the scaffold, at the hanging scaffold, warped our understanding of it in some ways.
So at this point, Luke and I are probably going to fight over In fact, the whole way through this episode, Luke and I are going to fight over the microphone because we've got so many questions. The first, I suspect, actually, is probably my first rabbit hole, I guess, is perhaps a question that I should have started with, which is just the term queer. Because growing up in the south of England, going to an all boys grammar school in the early 2000s, the term queer was a derogatory term.
Hmm.
Um, the Bo nearly spat out. Bo, you were right. You nearly spat out your tea there.
Yeah, it was the grammar school in the early 2000s. I just feel very old suddenly.
Well, I'm glad to have made you feel decrepit and ancient. So thumbs up, I guess. But I
I
like the way
console
that
myself with the fact that an all-boys grammar school in the south of England in the early 2000s is about the level of progressiveness that I experienced in a New York high school in the late 90s.
yeah, that's probably about right. Yes, yeah, I'd say that's fair. Um, my point is though that fundamentally the word queer was used in a very derogatory way. It was an insult.
Hmm.
And I was having this conversation with Luke in terms of quite how do we describe this episode? Because funnily enough, we don't want to kind of be derogatory in how we approach this topic. Surprise, surprise. Um, so I'm quite curious about the status that the term queer has, and has it kind of been reclaimed and repurposed since, when I'm sort of was most used to hearing people sort of use that term in such an unpleasant fashion.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's one I've been thinking about a lot recently. I actually had some discussions with groups of classes yesterday because I'm teaching some queer history courses at Hunter College in New York City this semester, this term. So I've been discussing this with my students. Queer is a word that's had a really fascinating career. It is traditionally a term of abuse. I was in secondary school around the same time as you both. It sounds like, and I experienced that as well. I knew it as an insult term. It has a longer history, both as an insult term, stretching back decades before that, but also a term of self-identification. The research seems to indicate that it was more common in Britain than in the U.S. for men who would in a later generation after Stonewall adopt gay instead, that they did use it as a term of self-identification. It then kind of roared back into popularity in the 80s in the United States and then elsewhere as part of the militant activism that erupted during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so people used it as a mobilizing term and a grouping term to pull together many different communities that were threatened by HIV/AIDS, that were experiencing government neglect. And so it became this kind of banner for people to rally around. And so there's been an ongoing process of reclamation, both as part of that, and then more recently as a term that people are using for self-identification as a way to group together many different communities and many different types of people under one big banner. So we could think about queer, and many people use it in this way to cover LGBTQIA plus people. That grouping can be very useful in some ways, but some some activists, some radicals, and others have pushed back against it as well and said that that kind of grouping may be inappropriate in the same way that some people have disputed LGBT plus, for instance, saying, well, not all those groups are the same. They don't necessarily have all the same goals or same aims or same needs. So it's a complicated set of questions. Queer has also been taken up in queer studies and in queer theory as an analytical category. It's a kind of interesting and destabilizing one because what is queer exactly? The way that we're using it in my class and the way that I use it in my research, my classes and my research, is anything that falls outside of a given society's, a given culture's norms of sex, sexuality, sexual activity, gender performance. But that's a kind of ambiguous term and it's a moving target as well. So queer will never be the same thing in different societies. I think it's a useful analytical category for us to use, a useful way to analyze what happens in the past. But of course, the people that I'm studying would not have called themselves queer, and that term wouldn't have been used at that time. The terms that were used are worth thinking about. We call these actors category as historians, thinking about the actual language that was used at the time. So for the kinds of people that I'm studying, they were using terms instead like sodomite, which is a complicated one to use. There were categories that were used for men who desired other men. There were communities in London, for instance, the Mollies, who were recognized and people spoke about them publicly, and they inhabited a kind of queer subculture. And so those are useful terms for us as well. But I do think it's really helpful for us to have language like queer and to use that when we're looking back historically to think about people who didn't fit those particular norms. But it's complicated, and that history of queer as an abuse term adds extra complications. Some people are quite unhappy with that, and I've encountered this myself talking to older gay men, for instance, who have a real memory of queer as an abuse term and are not comfortable with people using it. And the fact that it's become more popular and more widely used among younger generations can be a bit disturbing to people. And I certainly understand that reaction.
Absolutely. It's that how what is the power to reclaim versus the power to remember and all of that. And again that fascinating that relationship between its usefulness as a massive umbrella term and its problems being a massive umbrella term, right? It's that same thing. Uh I'm gonna jump down one of my rabbit holes to no one's surprise, and to anyone who listens to this podcast, they can probably see this question coming a mile away. But you mentioned the Mollies, and you mentioned sort of these acknowledged queer groups in London in the time, and these sort of things. One of the things that defines sort of the queer space in, to a certain extent, the modern world, but certainly in the 90s and early 2000s and the 80s, was that traditional sort of effete dandyism, very colorful, very sort of we dress how we want to dress and we have fun with it. We're not limited to society's norms. We acknowledge the rules and break them. But in the Georgian period, uh, dandyism or foppishism or macaronis and all of this are both much more common, but they also have that same problem to the average normal society of being too obsessed with fashion, of being too effeminate, and all of
Mhm.
that. And so I'm curious how much of that tradition goes back this far. Are they still being lambasted I mean, are they in fact fops and dandies in the modern sense? And are they in fact being lambasted for that? Or is that one of the more socially acceptable portions of it? Because you have, for example, a military culture that is festooned in ribbons and lace and gold braid that we would associate as, Freddie Mercury levels of fabulous. Um, but that was the peak of Georgian masculinity in a way.
It's a wonderful question. The history is really complicated, but there's a lot in there. So the maybe I could take it kind of group by group, and we could think about the different people who might be grouped under there. So the Malis were a an urban subculture of men who desired other men. The British public, the London public in particular, becomes aware of them around the year 1700. There's some exposés. Defoe writes one of them, one of the kind of famous ones that's better known by historians today. And the Malis would meet together in drinking establishments and inns and taverns, and they functioned a bit like early modern gay bars. And some people see this as one of the earliest kind of instantiations of that, the earliest versions of what we now know as the gay bar, although the gay bar seems to be going extinct. So there's a complex history there as well. The Malis did things that seem recognizable to us from modern queer cultures, including things that look a lot like drag. So they were accused of dressing like women, having these over the top feminine performances, taking women's names. And also meeting together in these places to have sex, to cruise, to party, all of these other sorts of things. And these are pretty well known now, in part because a lot of the legal crackdown that I was referring to before focused on the Malis, and so there were periodic raids against the Mali houses, although this might anticipate some of our discussion later. The Mali houses seem to have usually been allowed to just function clandestinely or semi-openly. So people seem to have been aware of them, but the raids actually weren't that common, less common than gay bar raids in this city, in New York City, in the 20th century, for instance. The Malis were accused of this kind of outrageous effeminacy. And there are some links to the fop, to the macaroni. The Malis themselves are an interesting group. They seem to have largely been kind of working class, maybe lower middle class. We could think of it in those terms. Whereas I would tend to associate the fop, the dandy, the macaroni with a more kind of elite masculinity. But there is also this charge of effeminacy against people like the macaronis, which is connected to this outrageous style of dress, a real focus on fashion and self-presentation. And that kind of effeminacy, my understanding of the research is that it doesn't necessarily imply homosexual interest or activity, but it could tip into that, and it was often read in that way. And military macaronis became quite problematic frequently. There's a wonderful new book, which I would recommend to all the listeners. It's an academic book, but very, very readable, from Johns Hopkins Press by John McCurdy, called Vicious and Immoral, about a military macaroni who was stationed in Philadelphia, so in the British Army, right at the time of the Revolution, and got into this ongoing long legal fight, many civil cases, several courts martial around allegations that he had sex with men. And it seems to have been very closely connected to the fact that he was a macaroni, that he dressed in these fashionable ways. And people were upset about that. He was a chaplain, so he's the parson. And so that the particular way that he was a man and that he dressed as a parson in particular seems to have upset some of the more conservative members of the regiment. And it was tied up with all this other interesting stuff going on in that regiment and in the British Army. Really, really fascinating book. I think we have a lot more to learn about the macaronis. And my friend, Professor Charles Upchurch, is actually writing a book about macaronis and homosexuality and arguments for decriminalization and all this other fascinating stuff that was going on at the time. But we do see repeated scandals around army figures, both in the army, military figures, both in the army and the navy, and dressing in very flamboyant and fashionable ways can become problematic for them, and it can be linked. So there is a longer history of these sorts of things, and some of this does look really recognizable to us from our own lives from today. And so I think that's one of the things that makes it really fascinating to study this stuff. These are these longer term genealogies, and we can trace this stuff, everything from the history of what look like gay bars to kind of effeminate gender presentation for men and high fashionability, that sort of stuff. It's really fascinating. It's a great question.
I mean, we could talk about this forever. I've written on sort of military dandyism in the 19th century,
Yeah.
and had a lot of fun with it. And sort of talking about sort of the line that gets drawn is sort of you can dress however you want as long as you've actually faced fire for our country. And that sort of that moment of like, okay, we're gonna take this dandyism, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna make fun of those people who use it as almost a stolen valor thing. It's like they're trying to overwhelm the fact that they're not serving by dressing the part.
And
Um,
there,
Sorry, Seth, go on.
yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, what was bubbling away in the back of my mind and Bo's sort of anticipated. For folks who aren't familiar, Luke has a nickname on the show, the Bo. Um, the, this has been kind of playing away in my mind as we've been talking that Wellington is referred to as the Bo. That's part of the in joke about Luke's nickname, um, as opposed to a dandy. But what's being described is fundamentally a dandyish tendency, and it was making me think: do they use the term Bo because they feel it's a safer term that doesn't have any implications behind it, that they are suggesting that Wellington is queer? And is there something tied up in that? Now, I've got no idea if that's the case, but it always struck me as odd. Why pick the Bo just for Wellington when fundamentally they could have sort of just had this thing of, Wellington's a bit of a dandy, and he absolutely was. But I wonder if it comes back to what Luke's saying about that need to kind of go, no, 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 Wellington, Marshall, ultra masculine. We put this guy up on a pedestal, and therefore they're trying to sort of disassociate him from some of the stigmas that are associated with the term dandy, which is more a
That's
comment than a question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that certainly seems plausible to me, and that kind of policing and careful splitting is very important in these settings, and people do sometimes need to explicitly or implicitly distance themselves from same-sex desire or from these associations.
yeah.
You both know much more about Wellington than I do, so I can't speak knowledgeably about that, but it seems plausible to me at least.
I would agree. I mean, the normal association with Bo, of course, is George Beau Brummel. And he's got that, but he has that same that thing, right? He's military serving, but nowhere near the level that Wellington is. But he's also, heavily masculine. We have reports of him having fights with fops in the street because there's that wonderful gang war between fops and dandies, which I adore as a concept. That goes on at this point, but at the same time, as yes, he's acceptable. He's the Prince of Wales' personal friend, all of that, but he's doing things that are also, by modern definitions, extremely queer. He has people come over and watch him dress as a spectator sport. Um, so there is, and there's that sort of thing about how something that a modern like drag stand-up comic could do 10 minutes on, but his ability to properly crease his cravat just by swallowing and moving his throat and chin up and down, like, come on, it's an own goal. But I will say one thing about Wellington that is interesting on this is what we most associate Wellington with in terms of dress. Famously, the two most famous things about him from a sartorial, actually the three most famous things about him from a sartorial term, is one, he was very famous on the battlefield for wearing relatively minimalist clothing, right? White trousers, riding boots, and a dark blue frock coat. Which is a very good look. We're not going to deny that one. But surrounded by all of these men in red and gold and all of that, it is entertaining. There's actually a parody play written in 1815 that I've talked about a little bit, where Wellington is seen, and then other people say that can't be Wellington. He's not dressed well enough. Um, but there's that. There's the Wellington boot, which is the Hessian boot, but without the gold braid and the tassels. Right? It's actually streamlined. That's the word I'm reaching for, and arguably quote unquote masculinized. And the other one, famously, is that he's one of the great pioneers of trousers. And in fact, he's banned from Almacs because he refuses to wear breeches and silk stockings. And he insists on wearing trousers, and the ladies sort of say, "No, you're not allowed in here." So there is that sort of very interesting line between the dandy and pushing into what we now consider to be sort of traditional masculine dress, quote unquote.
Can I also just hurl Murat into the mix? I'm really sorry, Seth. Like, we brought you on to have a conversation with you, and instead we're just sort of having a three-way conversation. It's really not turned into the interview I expected. I think we might as well just set fire to the question list, frankly, Luke. But
are you just jealous of the fact that I came up with Kiss Me Hardy and you're determined to not talk about queerness in the British Navy at all?
oh no, we're getting there. We are just going long on this episode. This this might end up being a three-parter or a nine-parter or something, quite frankly. Um, but you throw Muir into the mix, the breeches, ostrich feathers. You
Hmm.
know, if anybody mastered the buttock clench, and I mean, he wasn't sort of doing the bicep curl, but he was doing everything else with it. You know, again, nobody really is sort of turning around and suggesting that Murat is homosexual, but in relation to his dandyism, he takes things to whole other levels. Do you know what I mean? So there is some things going on here, and I don't understand it. That's all that I'm able to contribute to this, and I'm just very curious about how whether there's a sort of a sense for some of these people where they just don't care. You know, just you want to throw a label at me? Do I really care about that label? No, but I don't know if there's any kind of actual tangible evidence to back that. I'm just very conscious that we're sort of talking about these people who are doing things that very obviously push boundaries when it comes
I
to expectations on dress.
I mean, an interesting example to think of there may be Nelson as well. Nelson is such a rock star, of course, and he's able, therefore, to get away with a lot, including very flamboyant presentation and dress, and also very publicly being part of a throuple and violating all sorts of norms of sexual behavior and moral comportment because he's so famous and so beloved that he can get away with that. I don't think that he was read as queer in the terms of the time, but he definitely because he's so famous, because he's one of the most famous people, certainly in the English speaking world at that time, he's able to do what he wants. And so military is an important route to celebrity at that time for a few people. And so this might be a question of kind of what can celebrities do as well, because they're insulated by their celebrity,
Yeah.
and people might also expect outrageous behavior and be willing to allow that. And maybe celebrity studies of our own time can help us understand that a bit too.
Yeah, I mean Nelson was effectively untouchable except for by a French sniper. Um,
That's a
the
dark
other
joke. That's
it
a
is a
very
dark it's a
dark
very
joke.
dark joke.
But what I
But the
always
other
love about the Nelson story is the way the Victorians have an absolute aneurysm over, oh my God, no, he couldn't possibly have said kiss me, Hardy. No, it has to be Kismet. You know,
Oh my God. But the other great example of this, and we're going back into the early modern period, but I really do just want to throw it out there because I think it's a really tangible link, and I think it'd be a very interesting actually piece to explore the similarities. Are the Landsknecht units in early modern Germany? I mean, their job is to stand in the front row and charge pikes with swords, and like their lifetimes are measured in months. And because of this, they're allowed to completely violate the sumptuary laws. They're allowed to dress in whatever they want with outrageous codpieces and all of the silks they want, and that becomes their trademark, right? It's showing off their courage through this. In the same way that Murat sort of doesn't give a damn what's thrown at him title wise and can bedeck himself in ostrich feathers and leopard print because he may die the next day and it's just not worth the fight.
we have left our guest stunned into silence. Um,
He's
apologies.
just he's just thinking that he's just sitting here just going, why did they have me on? Why are they just not having a conversation, the two of them?
Yeah, we this is probably the worst interviewing we've ever done on this show. I am so sorry, Seth. I
No, this
really
this is
am.
wonderful. I mean, I was what I was thinking when you were talking is about the much longer history here, including and elite men at the time may have been aware of this as well, including examples like the Sacred Band of Thebes, the classical the classical culture, Greece and Rome, celebrated military homosexuality in
Mhm.
various different contexts and was a very important intellectual resource for elite men in particular at that time. So I think all of this stuff is swirling around, and there are lots of ways in which uh, military men, the image of the military, has become queered historically and that people have seen it that way. Um, we can think about the ways that gay communities have eroticized men in uniform and military men over time, and also the many places in which we find things like gay sex scandals in different militaries. It happened persistently through the early modern period, certainly in Britain. Those are the set of armed forces I can talk about the most knowledgeably, but we find them in many other places. The Newport training station scandal here in the United States, for instance, is one that really fascinates me. There's a theater and art piece that's been on in Rhode Island on and off this last year that deals with that, for instance. There's a very long history here. There's a lot to dig into, and these are real cultural connections that have developed over a very long period of time.
Yeah, and there's always, of course, that relationship, right? It's the Victorians and the Georgians have this sort of lionization of the Greeks, especially, and sort of Sparta as that premier masculinity, and we don't talk about the whole open homosexuality that the entire military structure was built on. Never mind, just happened. It was a part of the system that they worked in. We've completely abandoned the questions at this point, but I do have a thought. I want to sort of this is something that is not in the questions, but I'm interested in because you're doing a lot of stuff on empire as well, and
Shock.
that's someplace that what yeah I know
Luke
right
asking about Empire.
yes. Um, but I'm curious about, and it ties into what we've been talking about, right? The sort of queerness, homosexuality, and particularly its appearance, right? And how that ties into manliness in terms, especially of projecting power. And is this one of these cases where they're so keen in the cases where they do punish it, they're so keen to do it because they feel it's breaking the like the wall of invulnerability that they're trying to project across the empire.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that is part of it. That's certainly my interpretation, and we can talk more about the precise history of the way that the Royal Navy police same-sex behavior when they cracked down and when they didn't. But I think that the periodic, relatively limited, but very real crackdowns that we find where they would try men for having sex together in courts martial and punish them very harshly when they were convicted is about shoring up masculinity and about shoring up a kind of authority-bearing masculinity. So ships rely on a very finely graded military and sailing hierarchy, and they're concerned about misuse of power in that setting, and they want people to act. They want men and sailors and officers in particular to act in the right masculine ways. And I think that race and the kind of spread of the empire is a very important part there. One really interesting finding in my research is that many of the men who were policed were non-white or perceived as non-white. They were not native English speakers. They're described as being black, as having woolly hair, which is a frequent way of describing non-white people at the time. Um, and I think that there's a lot going on there. It's a really complicated bundle of cultural associations and beliefs and ideologies. The association there are very strong associations, and this is used to justify empire and justify imperial domination. Strong associations between what's seen as unnatural sexual behavior and gender performance, and other peoples in Europe even. So the British often say the French, the Italians, Catholics are like this, that they're sodomites, that they're effeminate, et cetera, et cetera. It's often associated with people called Turks, but also people farther afield, people who are seen as less developed, less civilized, less human. And so sodomy in particular, the charge of sodomitical behavior is used to justify imperial domination. It's something that is alleged against Native people in North America, for instance. Um, it's really fascinating, though, because contact with those cultures and the different sexual and gender cultures that are available there also provides a resource for people to think in more complex ways about gender and sexuality back in the metropole as well, back in Britain. And the effects of that are not simple, and this really provides a kind of intellectual resource for people to think about their own behavior, their own sexual activity, their own genders in new and really startling and sometimes shocking sorts of ways. And I think that that's part of, uh, we see certainly in British culture, a real reverence for sailors, but also a real distrust and fear of them in a lot of cases. And I think part of that is they travel to these scary, faraway places. Who knows who they're going to meet? They're going to meet cannibals. They're going to meet sodomites. What kinds of things are they going to bring back? And people are aware that they bring back practices that are not found in the British Isles, even things as simple to our eyes as tattooing, for instance, which are picked up overseas and then imported back. What does that mean, and how will that affect the nation? So there's so much stuff going on there, but it's really rich, and I think your question is pointing at some important stuff.
I want to pick up on what you were saying there about and have alluded to earlier in terms of some of the language around the legal process, because one of the things that strikes me when I come across court martials in the British Army for um, for homosexuality fundamentally is that never is the language more unprofessional in terms of how the language is framed than when it comes to a charge for homosexuality. Because, and I'm quoting directly here, folks, these are the words used in the charge, so quite obviously no offense intended. Um, Firstly, the word unnatural, the unnatural crime of sodomy. Um, but sometimes it goes even further than that, and you've got words like detestable, um, unnatural behavior, sometimes used as an almost euphemistic way of referring to um, uh, fundamentally sodomy. Also, the term buggery also being used. None of these ways of expressing what the accused is supposedly being charged with, that framing, that language does not happen for something like desertion, for something like theft. Doesn't happen, frankly, in relation to rape. And there I'm referring to heterosexual rape. There's a whole separate kind of conversation that we can perhaps have about the way in which uh, a trial might sort of unfold and indicate actually indications of homosexual rape and the way that that's phrased. So we'll put that to one side. But the way in the wording behind this has always baffled me. And I'm curious if you see a similar thing either in the civilian legal system, but particularly given your work on Navy court martials, whether there's an equivalence in the Royal Navy. And I don't have a sense of quite what that tells us, but what do you think that might tell us about what's going on here?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. The language is really striking. So the crime, the name for the crime coming out of civilian criminal law, which again, the first criminal prohibition is adopted under Henry VIII, is sodomy or buggery. Those terms are used interchangeably. They're quite ambiguous terms, and we can talk about what the kind of common law tradition developed in terms of a definition of them. But there is really striking negative language. I would say the language that you're finding in the Army criminal cases is very similar to what's in the Navy cases as well. The Navy was more aggressive about cracking down on same-sex behavior than the Army, at least from the research I've been able to study. That's my understanding. Um, the language is quite similar, and I think that's all developed out of the civilian criminal law. So these codes that are being applied to men in the military, men and boys in the military, are modeled on that. And so they're taking language like that. So the Articles of War, which is the Navy's criminal code, adopts directly from the civilian criminal law. And the phrase that they use to describe buggery is the unnatural and detestable crime. And in fact, and this is frequently the case with criminal laws throughout Europe in this time, there's a strong association between sex between men and bestiality, and so they're actually treated as the same crime in the Henrician in Henry VIII that criminal statute, and also in the Articles of War as well. I think what that reflects is this legal tradition and the legal tradition heavily influenced by religious ways of thinking as well. And that's where we get some of this language about naturalness, about detestability. It's really striking and disturbing to read, but we should be careful to go back to the first answer I gave you when we started. We should be careful to not assume that that very striking language reflects what general attitudes were at the time. The language is quite stereotyped in these legal cases, and there are reasons for that. They are pointing back to these specific laws. They're looking at the Articles of War, for instance, when they're framing charges, writing up sentences and verdicts, that sort of stuff. So it tells us some really important things, but it's also not the whole story, is what I would say.
Yeah, what I've realized as you've made that very important point is that actually my thinking behind that question was entirely skewed by essentially what was going to be a sub question to the planned set, which is about the legal status of the inverted commas crime as it was perceived. Because one of the things that I cannot wrap my head around within the army context is on what authority the army tried people for homosexuality. Because you talk quite rightly about the Articles of War, and I'm not familiar with the naval Articles of War. Clearly, I do know my way around the army ones. In the army, it is not a stated crime. So when you bring somebody up for trial for, as they would refer to it, sodomy, the only loophole you could use to do that is to say, well, the Articles of War have a facility by which we can try civilian crimes in the army if there isn't a legal authority in the land. Now, the reality is there is always a legal authority, a local civilian court where you could try these folks, which therefore means that the army's prosecution is inherently illegal. And the executions for these guys are a textbook case of judicial murder that has no legal premise whatsoever. And I can't find any indication. I completely hear what you're saying, and what you're saying, particularly in relation to it being compared almost to bestiality. I can see that reflected in some of the trials that I've come across, but I can't find any authority under which the army tries people for homosexuality. It does not exist, which therefore begs some very complicated questions about what Navy law says and how Navy law does kind of have the legal basis at least checked off, and interplays between army law and civilian law and Navy law, because clearly the same attitude and the same legal process is being employed, but it's being employed in a context where it doesn't have any legal grounding.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And right. So I think it might be able to tell us a lot that the Navy is clear to outlaw it, and they do that right from the first Articles of War, the first general Articles of War adopted, which is adopted by statute by Parliament in the 17th century. The revision in the mid 18th century has it as well. They're careful to include that. So it is perhaps telling that we don't have something exactly comparable in the army.
Is that partially because the Army has local law to fall back on, whereas the Navy has to factor in the case of when they're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and there is no local law, there is only the captain, the Navy, and the law of the ship?
Is that a question for me or Seth or both?
I mean, both, honestly. I mean, there is this, sort of the Navy, to my mind, has to be more specific about this because the way it works is fundamentally the only way to get rid of a troublemaker in certain places is to execute them, right? You can't put them. Yes, you can put them in a brig, I suppose, but it's still in a long-term isolation in a way that the army doesn't have to deal with. The army can send them away, can put them in send them to a different regiment, can discharge them in theory. If the Navy is on a long trip, they can't do that. Their hands are tied.
Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense. I that that could I think that could be the explanation, certainly. The Navy functions with similar provisions, so anything that's not explicitly outlined in the Articles of War can be tried under local criminal law. Um, the the question of when to hold a trial is an interesting one. The Navy the Navy justice system works quite differently from the Army one in some important ways, including there's um, there's there is not a lower level court martial system, so there's nothing comparable to the regimental court martial. They only have general courts martial, and the requirements for holding that are actually pretty high. You need more than a dozen captains, so you need to be in a port to hold it in most cases. Um, the fact that they don't have that lower level court system, that lower level type of trial, has some really interesting implications, including that they don't hold that many buggery trials. Actually, it's one of the least frequently tried crimes in the Articles of War, where there are any trials at all. And I think one thing that the archival research suggests pretty strongly is that captains preferred to not bring these cases to trial. So there's something special going on in the cases where they do happen. And so to go back to your idea of how to dispose of it, if there's a troublemaker or a problem, informal disposition seems to have been the main way to do it. So just giving him a flogging, kicking him off the ship. We have some good documented cases of that. So dropping him at the nearest port or something like that, or dealing with it in some other semi-official or unofficial way. And trial was really a last resort or used when you wanted to send a very specific message.
Oh, my crime and punishment thesis intensifies completely at the mention of that, pragmatic and alternative methods of punishment. A few things to bring into this. Firstly,
That's your Tinder headline, isn't it,
oh, you're
Zach?
not meant to know about my Tinder profile. Um, the Firstly, in response to Luke's previous point, not the Tinder point, I think there's also perhaps something in the status of military law, and Seth, I'm very interested in your perspective because I don't know the status of Navy law, or Navy military law. But I mean, if you go back to the very old legal texts, you've got people like Blackstone turning around and saying that martial law is in fact no law at all and shouldn't be allowed. Now, there's a big kind of unanswered question within that about what actually is martial law that nobody ever really kind of wraps their head around. But the army really has this kind of feeling that it's been attacked and it's on the back foot, and it kind of defends itself as, well, we are military and therefore martial law, but we are legitimate law. But I wonder if that kind of origin of thinking, bearing in mind that Blackstone is one of the leading people who sort of shapes how people think about the law, um, whether that has an impact in terms of how the army develops its law, in the sense that it's always subsidiary to civilian law. Doesn't matter where it is in the world, it's always subsidiary to civilian laws. Civilian law always trumps army law. And so therefore, is this kind of aspect of never explicitly stating that actually we are going to try homosexuality and we are going to treat it along these lines, is that a product of that, where nobody's ever sort of thought through this implication? They've kind of gone, well, we've always got civilian law, we'll just handle it as a sort of civilian crime, and nobody's kind of thought through the actual stipulations and implications.
I that certainly seems plausible to me. That would make sense. In for the Articles of War, the Navy's Articles of War, most of what's in there are things that are unique to sailing ships and to military sailing ships in particular, or not just ships, boats, any sort of vessels that they have in the fleet. That would make a lot of sense, but then there is this question of why does the Navy insert or why do the legislators who write that insert it for the Navy? But that seems plausible to me. I feel a bit out of my depths as a legal historian here, but I would be interested to know more. And I wonder if that research is out there. Perhaps for the reasons that you're talking about, it can be quite hard actually to learn about the kind of legal history here for military law in particular. It's not as well documented, and the legal commentators for the Navy, for instance, we don't get a lot of legal writing until late in the 18th century, and it's very practically oriented as well. We have less kind of theoretical discussion than if we were reading someone like Blackstone, which makes it challenging to. I have found it makes it challenging to figure out some of these questions. Yeah.
You and I need to have a conversation about work that's ongoing in terms of me trying to sort of bring legal history into the the mainstream because sorry folks, you're now hearing sort of a historic well basically what you've heard here is basically what happens at a conference where historians hear each other's research and suddenly fireworks go off inside our brains. We then spend an hour and a half ignoring everybody else in the conference, standing in a corner having a very intense conversation about our respective research areas, firing more neurons, and then deciding that we all need to do an edited collection where we bring our work together. So Beth and I will be having conversations subsequently. um
I just want to throw in, it's an early example of this, and it is civilian, it's not military, but I think it's a good illustration of the sort of the cases where the nautical side is just like, I don't want to deal with this. Put it on land. We're done. I don't. I pretend this doesn't exist. This is a quote from the Sea Journal of the Reverend Francis Higginson, who was first minister of the plantation at Salem in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So we're going way back here. But this is Tuesday, sort of June 23rd. This day, and he's at sea at this point. This day we examined five beastly sodomatical boys, which confessed their wickedness not to be named, although you've just named it. The fact was so foul we referred them to be punished by the governor when we came to New England, who afterwards sent them back to the company to be punished in Old England as the crime deserved. So we have these five boys who are caught and they're dragged in front of the captain, which is probably the standard thing. And the captain goes, I don't want to deal with this. Give them to the governor in New England. And they get to the governor in New England. The governor is like, I don't want to deal with this. Send it back to England. And I don't have a record of what happens at the end of this. I feel horrible for these five boys who are basically shipped back and forth across the Atlantic trying to decide if they're going to be hanged or not. Um, but I think it's a very interesting. I use it in my teaching to illustrate just how common transverse across the Atlantic world was. Right? It's not this one-way journey that we think about it as. But it's a
but
good
also
example, I think, of this sort of jumping in and out of court systems.
but also the term boys there, I wonder, and Seth, this is kind of a question, really that you are far better placed to answer than I could. I'm speculating here, but by referring to them as boys, do you therefore make their behavior feel less subversive by implying a sort of childlike status? And so in a modern parlance today, we would use the term boys to refer to somebody probably under the age of 13 and then teenager for 13 onwards. Now, obviously, that terminology doesn't exist back then. And there is a lot of conflation over terms like drummer boys, who, again, we mentioned Eamon O'Keefe. He's made the point that actually drummer boys could be into their 20s. But if you refer to them as boys, you kind of imply this childlike status. You can then sort of wrap that around implications that, well, they don't really know what they're doing. And so you therefore just turn the heat down on the conversation, perhaps. And I just wonder if that's a thing that you've observed, or whether actually this is an entirely accurate historical point, and maybe we do have indications of age. And yeah, these five kids are just exploring their bodies.
Yeah, that's a wonderful set of questions. Uh, boy is a frequently used and very ambiguous term, as you're suggesting, and I think that ambiguity was very useful for a lot of people. And sometimes it could function in the way that you're talking about to lessen the seriousness of a crime. Boys in the Navy, and I'm sure there's something comparable in the Army as well, traditionally were punished in less severe ways. So whereas sailors who were recognized as men, not officers. Officers' bodies were sacrosanct, but sailors recognized as men would be flogged with the cat of nine tails on their bare back. Boys were instead paddled on their bottoms, kissing the gunner's daughter. They were made to bend over, which is a fascinating thing to imagine in this context. So it could lessen severity and lessen punishment, but that's not always the case. And so people described as boys were given full punishments. I document a case in my edited volume that you mentioned at the beginning of somebody described as a boy being hanged for buggery. In some cases, the kind of official age of consent in the criminal law system was not respected, and people seen as boys were still punished, even though technically they shouldn't have been. This larger discussion we're having, the last few things that we've been talking about, really points to the ways and the kind of patchwork overlapping nature of these early modern justice systems, the way that they conflict with each other, and people don't follow the official rules a lot of the time as well. I think particularly in these military courts where they're almost entirely amateur courts as well, you frequently don't have anybody with legal training actually involved, certainly in the Navy, and I would imagine that was the case in the Army as well. We need to sit down and talk about all this. I'm very excited to get into it some more. So yeah, there's a lot going on with the boys piece of it, and I can talk about that some more in part, and this gets to something you were referring to before, many of the cases that came to trial in civilian settings and certainly in the military were not cases of consensual sex, at least as alleged in the trial, cases of consensual sex between consenting men, but instead they were age stratified relationships. And there's some allegation of force, coercion, violence between an adult man and an adolescent or a boy. And those seem to have been the kind of sexual relationships that were most likely to disturb people who became aware of them. Although I've also certainly found in my research, and I suspect that the Army materials suggest something too, that that kind of abuse of young soldiers, young sailors, and we know this is the case for apprentices and domestic workers as well, that it was actually quite common and largely permitted in the society as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Luke. I know you want to sort of contribute to this conversation, but
No,
we're in.
I just have I have a very brief question building on this that I think will add to this. Okay, okay, go.
So I am gesturing feverishly behind, partly because I have a case that very neatly kind of reflects some of the things that you're talking about here, Seth. So apologies, Luke. It's one of those rare moments where I do what I always do and just kind of force you to be quiet. But in relation to what you're saying there about sexual assault, there are two things. Firstly, you've talked about frequency. I would need to double check the numbers because the more I find sort of different euphemistic terms to describe sexual assault and also homosexuality, the more I find I end up with sort of different numbers depending on quite what I'm able to filter. But I think there are more trials for homosexuality than there are for rape, heterosexual rape, in the courts martial, which I think tells us a number of very pointed things about where societies, or at least the British Army's sort of legal focus is in terms of behavior that it considers unacceptable. The other discrepancy, of course, is in punishment, and I've talked about this before. You've alluded already to the fact that those convicted of sodomy can be executed, or they're receiving 1,000, 1,200 lash floggings in the army. Obviously, different in the navy, different kind of gradings of punishment. Whereas heterosexual rape is treated almost like a misdemeanor. It's almost like a regimental court-martial category of crime that gets tried at general courts-martial, and the floggings are sort of 400, 500. Occasionally, I've seen a couple of 800 lash floggings, but pathetic in relation to the way in which something like desertion is treated. You know, it speaks volumes about the grading of these crimes, but also to what you're saying about the allusions towards homosexual rape. The case that always springs to mind to me, and the one that frankly I find the most disturbing out of many disturbing cases that I've read about, is the instance where two guys are discovered during the course of the Peninsular War, and they're both placed on trial for the same crime, and it's framed in, you know, sort of unnatural crime of sort of all the things that we've talked about already. One of them escapes conviction, the other doesn't. The reason given for the acquittal of one of these guys is that he was so inebriated that it was impossible for him to know what was happening, which is textbook, as we know today, what we would describe as sort of things like date rape and all the rest of it. Now, at no point does anybody ever then look at an additional charge, not least perhaps because the other guy is convicted and sentenced to be executed. So does an additional trial actually serve any purpose? But there is never anything for the victim in that scenario. which again sort of speaks volumes about the way in which the legal system is geared not towards things like restitution and justice for victims, but actually is all about control of behavior.
Yeah, that's fascinating and disturbing to hear. I have found a few cases like that as well, and there's a lot in what you're saying. Let me give you a couple of reactions, and maybe we can talk through it some more. Uh, the comparison between sexual crimes against girls and women and with or against men is really interesting. In the Navy, there are almost no cases of prosecutions for sex crimes against girls and women. They're very, very, very rare. I found a few of them, and I've been able to document others as well. And we have other documentation, including there's this really fascinating case, a journal that's held at the National Maritime Museum now, where a sailor, in fact, admits to rape, and then he tried to cover up the entry, actually, and it's been recovered. So we have some of that, and there's a very strong association culturally between sailors and sex crimes against women. There's this idea that they're a real sexual danger. The Navy's not interested in that, though. It almost never tries those cases. Now, the question of consent and rape between men, or in most of the cases between men and adolescents or boys in these trials, is a really complicated one for a variety of reasons. Um, in rape law and in sodomy law at this time, they're both based on a consent model, but rape, sexual assault against girls and women is different because when it's between two males, you can never consent legally because no sexual contact of any sort is allowed. It's always illegal. So the only way to defend yourself is to argue against consent. And something like saying I was blackout drunk and being able to prove that is one of the only ways to protect yourself. This also creates an incentive in these trials for each man or each person involved to both argue that they didn't consent. And so reconstructing what actually happened is a very challenging thing to do, in particular because, and I found the same thing as what you're describing, the courts don't have any sympathy or really interest in the condition, the experiences of the person that they understand to be the victim. In fact, they're very distrustful of them in most cases, is what I've found. Even when they're quite young, there's an idea that they might have been selling sex, that they were trading sex for preference or clothes or food or something like that, and a real willingness to find them culpable as well, including, to go back to my earlier response, including in cases where they're below the age of consent, below the male age of consent. Still, there's this idea that they might be culpable. Now, we should say we still see these kinds of ideas circulating today. There are very disturbing examples. Some historians of sexual violence have documented this ideas that 13-year-old girls led men on or something like that. So we see that in modern justice systems too, but it's a very, very strong trend in these pre-modern justice systems. So untangling all of this is incredibly challenging, but all the things that you're raising are really important, and they're major features of these trials and of this justice system when we look at these topics. Yeah.
I promised
If
Luke the
this
mic, and I will hand you the mic, I promise. But just to add to what you're saying there, Seth, also true in civilian legal systems. Very distressing cases of I've come across where girls have, and we're talking children of the ages of sort of under 10 being examined, found to quite clearly have been sexually assaulted by an individual who has an STI, and the presence of the STI is found on the young girl. And still the prosecution, the case for the defense, if you like, is this child seduced me, and successful defenses along those lines as well, even with frankly undisputable medical evidence, and doctors kind of examining victims and sort of saying, well, you know, the accused has syphilis. I can find evidence of the child having syphilis. You know, clear indications of assault here. In other ways that I'm not going to sort of outline, folks can probably understand why. And still, people get off. So there is this very strong indication that actually there's still a hell of a long way to go on issues of how society acknowledges sexual violence, because we're still dealing fundamentally with attitudes that aren't even 200 years old, because the attitudes that you and I come across can be traced back another 2, 3, 4, 500 years. But sorry, Luke, I promised you that you would actually be allowed to say something on the show that you host.
So yeah, if the poor cultural historian can get a word in edgewise, no, absolutely not. No, this is actually very closely related, and it's sort of tying in a few of the questions that we've been talking about recently. And this is actually a genuine question for both of you. I am curious. We're talking about sort of right the defense the defense quote unquote of rape, and sort of that question of consent and all of that, and victim blaming and all of this. And we were talking about language earlier, and I'm genuinely curious if either of you have seen a direct correlation between describing, and Seth, you talked a little bit about sort of the adolescence and the men and grooming and things like that. But I'm curious if there's a language relationship between men penetrating and boys being penetrated. Is the term boy versus man used in a giving versus receiving demarcation?
So I can cover that, whilst in order to give Seth sort of a bit of time to think, because my answer ends up being very simple. Um, I have never come across a um, trial for what at the time would have been tried. I've never come across a trial transcript for what at the time would have been described as sodomy, nor have I ever come across a trial transcript for heterosexual rape. The only transcript that I've ever come across where there's an allusion to homosexual behavior is for an officer trial. And, if we're interested, we can discuss that in more detail later, which basically means that I don't have the information to answer that question for you, because we have a whole issue that I've talked about before on this show about how the vast majority of trial proceedings just do not survive. Somebody's gone and burnt them at some point in time. So from an army perspective, I simply can't answer that, but it's interesting.
Um, First, I'll just start with that. That's really fascinating. And what I'll say is that, and this is a really unique set of sources. The Navy courts-martial transcripts do survive almost entirely intact. They're held at Kew at the National Archives in London. They are absolutely extraordinary. They are challenging to work with in a lot of ways, but they are one of the richest social history sources that exists, full stop, for that time period. Um, the sodomy trials are only a very small part of it, but we can learn a huge amount, and we're very, very fortunate they survive. Up to 1840, post 1840, most of them have been destroyed. And I did have the absolutely crushing experience of being in Kew and trying to call up later ones and getting a box that was basically empty, and it had the Public Record Office note that said pulp all of these. So at some point the archivists or other records keepers made the decision to destroy the Victorian ones, which is gutting, a terrible loss. But we do have really complete sources pre 1840. So for what I'm looking at, between the late 17th century and the mid 19th, which is remarkable. What I'll say there is, I do think linguistically, and certainly in terms of the way people conceived of sexual relationships, there is a really strong association between between the sexual role and the role of being penetrator or being the receptive partner, being the top or the bottom, to use the kind of gay parlance that's used today. If we're thinking about not Tinder profiles, but Grindr profiles instead, that's what you would indicate. And this goes way back. This goes back to the classical world, where same-sex interactions are normalized, but it's very much about sexual role, and that is closely tied to your status, to your age, et cetera, et cetera. And so the penetrating partner is higher in the social hierarchy, and this is how sex is understood if it's between two males or between a male and a female. So as the man, you're higher in the social hierarchy than your wife, than a slave who's a sex worker, than a domestic worker, and it's appropriate for you to take that role. On the other hand, if you flip that around, it's seen as deeply shameful and dishonorable to receive penetration, to be the penetrated partner in Greece and Rome. And we find this practice, we find that way of conceiving of sex. At the time, it's often talked of as active and passive. So taking the active role or the passive role. We still see this in the language. That's used in some places. So top and bottom, the ways that those are figured in French or Spanish, for instance, activo and passivo, for instance. So we still have remnants of that, although I guess English hasn't maintained that in the same sort of way. But we see that way of organizing sex and understanding it throughout European history, and it's very well documented in same-sex communities and same-sex sexual practices in places like Italy in the Renaissance, for instance. And there's some really wonderful research dealing with that period and that place. And it's certainly the way that it is largely understood in Britain and in the military and in the army and the navy at that period, as far as I can tell, certainly in the navy for the documents that I have. And so there's an idea that the older partner will be an adult man. And very frequently, for the cases that they're trying, it's an adolescent or a boy who's what they think of as the passive partner. That's how they think about sex between men and women as well. And that is a stereotyped way of understanding sex. And so it's another way in which these kind of cultural assumptions and stereotypes shape what we see in the trial record as well. So we know that actual sexual activity was more complicated. And so men traded sexual roles, for instance. I've documented that extensively in the Navy records, for instance. They would switch roles. I found cases in which the younger partner is the penetrating partner for an adult man. In one case, it's a younger black man penetrating an older white man, which would go against assumptions about how sex worked in that society, but clearly it took place, or they could at least understand the possibility that it took place. We need to be very suspicious of these legal records for reasons that I've been talking about. We don't know for sure that those things actually happened, but it was conceivable to people, and the men on that ship at least believed that it had happened, or they were saying that in court. So those are kind of very deeply rooted fundamental ways of conceiving of sex and sexual relationships, regardless of the gender or other features of the partners. But they don't describe everything that took place, and we should be open to evidence of much more complex, much more diverse sexual activity and sexual cultures as well.
It's good to know that the idea of a verse switch goes back to the Georgian period.
Exactly.
There's a an elephant in the room in all of this, a question that frankly I should have asked when you raised. I mean, I scribbled down this note literally an hour ago, in response to, I think, your opening response, because you talked about how the the legal attention is fundamentally on sex between men. Why? Why specifically single out sex between men as the behavior that is treated in this way? Is I've got something sitting in the back of my mind about early modern attitudes towards um, things like sort of Galen's four humors and all kinds of stigmas around female bodies and sort of thoughts that um, because the man is perceived as sort of the pinnacle of everything that's good in the world, um, women attempting to emulate male behavior by desiring another woman is somehow something that is seen as it's seen as subversive, and it's still part of sort of turning the world upside down, but nonetheless it's not regarded in the same way, and certainly not attached, doesn't have the same stigma attached to it as sex between men. Is that what's at play there, a sort of a an evolution of that thinking, or is there something else about why everybody's sort of everybody the legal system seems to be so fixated on sex between men and isn't fixated on sex between women in the same way? And yes, I know, folks, that military is predominantly staffed by men, so therefore the military legal system isn't necessarily going to fixate on sex between women, but the civilian legal system seemingly, certainly to my knowledge, doesn't have this same fixation. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
This is one of the great puzzles in certainly in European queer history, and I'm very excited. For instance, as I said, I'm teaching a queer European history class this semester. I'm very excited to see what my students think about this. For instance, I don't have a simple or straightforward answer there, but what you're talking about is a very interesting phenomenon that we can observe. Sex between women has certainly been frowned upon historically, has been criminalized. We can document women being punished, including being put to death for sexual activity and for also for gender performance connected to sexual activity that's seen as inappropriate. Things like as it was understood or described at the time, acting masculine, penetrating when you shouldn't be with a dildo, with something else like that. But it is the case that that the criminalization and punishment has usually focused on men in particular. And in the period we're focused on in kind of Enlightenment era Britain, 19th century Britain, almost all of the legal attention is focused on men having sex with each other. There's very little effort to police and to punish. I think that's particularly interesting as well because there is a lot of social anxiety around women's sexual activity, inappropriate sexual behavior, sex outside of marriage and pregnancy, of course. And there are these deeply rooted ideas that women are sexually uncontrolled, that they are more sexual and need more restraint. Historians of medicine, feminist historians, and others. My mentor, Mary Fussell, a wonderful historian, has documented this in a lot of ways around anxieties around reproduction and the maternal body. So why are they not policing this particular sort of behavior in the same way? One of the challenges that this introduces actually is we know a lot more about men who had sex with men because it was policed and prosecuted so much more frequently. We have much less documentation of women who desired and loved other women. We do have some wonderful cases. I'll recommend all your readers, all your listeners, check out material on Anne Lister, for instance. In the early 19th century, absolutely fascinating figure who left a voluminous biography showing that she desired women, she slept with a lot of women, she thought about this in really interesting, sophisticated terms and did research to understand herself. But we don't have anything comparable to the Mollies. We don't have anything comparable to all of these trials on men in the 18th and 19th centuries. Um, I don't know exactly what the explanation is. I'm going to leave it as a bit of a puzzle for everybody too. I'm really interested in the writing of historians and other people who've thought about these questions, and they come to some really interesting conclusions, including that there's a persistent failure for men writing about this or thinking about it to be able to imagine what sex between two women is, to understand and recognize and think that women could desire each other, that they could fall in love, and what sexual behavior between them would look like. Perhaps part of it, we've been talking about this very heavy focus on penetration in particular, that failure of imagination and the importance of penetration for understanding of sexuality might explain part of it, that they couldn't recognize sex between women because their understandings of sex did not encompass that, and because their imaginations were so limited about what was possible between two women. But it's really intriguing, and yeah, I'll suggest people read some lesbian history because there's been a lot of wonderful research by people who understand this better than I do.
If we're going to lay part of the blame on, or the explanation on male lawmakers just not being able to comprehend this, not being able to think about this correctly, there also presumably has to be some of it about those same male lawmakers or different male lawmakers experiencing roughly 2.5 centuries of gay panic. Of we have to punish this because I could be next in a quote unquote way, right? Like I can't, that terror of being the bottom in this case. So sort of, there's that old saw about ho homophobia is just a man worrying that another man will treat him the way he treats a woman, right? It's that side of this. And because men are writing all of these laws, there has to be, in my opinion, at least a little bit of that tied in here.
That would make a lot of sense to me. The kind of persistent and very thorough ways in which women are marginalized in the very extreme patriarchy of this period, I think would make a lot of sense. And yeah, what are the men thinking of? And if we're thinking about elite men as well, this goes back to some earlier discussion we had. There are, of course, persistent allegations that elite men are in sodomitical relationships. This is something that every single king of England in this period is charged with, is fear about royal favorites. So perhaps to bring up some of what you were discussing earlier, perhaps this is about policing their own class group as well, and about the kinds of fears you're talking about. I could certainly see that.
I mean, we've reached a situation where I'm looking back over the 8 questions that we sent you in advance of this interview.
We've
And
covered all of them and none of them.
that's exactly what I was about to say. Like we basically burnt the set list and yet still basically ended up in a roundabout way, sort of covering aspects of all of them. Although I think if we'd kept with the set list, then we'd have probably pulled out different strands and probably actually had a less dynamic and frankly interesting conversation, at least from our perspectives.
Yeah, I would agree with
Even
that.
if it might have been easier for listeners to actually follow had we kept with the questions. But I
Let's
am
not
going to,
start worrying about our listeners now.
well, why break the habit of an entire show, right? Um, I am going to, however, end with the question that we did plan to be the sort of the end point for this, which is the inevitable question about where do we go from here with research. And I appreciate that we haven't sort of done a clear sort of outline of where the historiography, where the history of history has gone. But nonetheless, the question is still important. You know, we have touched on a whole series of things. Actually, folks have heard about research that is going to get published at some point in the future through our discussions of both of our work and what we've sort of seen, but haven't necessarily written on as yet. So, what do you think is next? And perhaps the more pertinent question: what is needed next in terms of scholarly attention, so that we can keep the kind of momentum in terms of the progress that we've seen in the last sort of couple of decades?
It's a wonderful question. Let me talk a little bit about kind of what I'm excited about exploring myself, and then also really cool new research, and not just kind of traditional academic research that's going on. I'm really fired up about, and I think it's very promising and important to bring in trans perspectives and non-binary perspectives here and think about how trans history fits as well. I've documented some people, including in my collection. I hope people will check that out, who certainly fit into trans history, even if modern trans identities, of course, did not exist back then in the same way that modern queer identities didn't as well. And there's been a lot of fascinating new research that is out or is coming out that can tell us a lot. I'll recommend, this is another academic book, but very readable. And I think all your listeners could get a lot from it and would find it really enjoyable. A wonderful recent book by the scholar Jen Mannion called Female Husbands, which is about people assigned female at birth who took male gender identities and then married. This was a well-known phenomenon at the time. There are some people who are clearly fictional, but some who we can document as real living people as well, who became known to the public. There is a section in that book, it's not the entire book, but a section on sailors. And there's a lot more to do there because gender crossing, cross dressing, transing gender performance, non binary sailors is a well documented phenomenon. And it was known at the time. There were well known cases of people who, in particular, were assigned female at birth and took on male identities and went to sea in the Navy, in merchant fleets, and elsewhere. And I think that can really enrich what we know about this. And I've been really excited to see ways in which professional historians have been doing this work, but also people in other settings as well. I was a Caird Fellow. I was a long-term research fellow at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich in the UK. Over the last couple of years. And I got to work with a community queer history group, a lot of young researchers, artists, activists, and other people who are going to the archives. Sometimes they're doing kind of traditional history projects, but sometimes they're creating artwork, they're doing fan fiction, they're creating all sorts of interesting stuff. And they're really interested in these sorts of questions. And they bring really different perspectives, even from someone like me. I'm older than them. I grew up in different contexts and have a particular academic training. And so come at this in a particular sort of way. And I'm really excited to see what people like that come up with. It's been really cool to work with them and to learn from them. So those are some of the things that I'm really excited about in the field, and I think is going to expand it in important ways and teach us a lot more about lives in the past, in the Navy, in the Army, in other settings. Yeah.
Definitely stuff that needs work and that I'm looking forward to seeing. It's going to be spectacular, and clearly we're going to have you back on at some point as your own work expands and as the rest of the scholarship in this field influences your thinking, Zach's thinking, to a certain extent, my thinking. Every time they mention silk, um, it is what it is. We have one more question for you. Now, we mentioned this at the top of the show. We have a Patreon. Listeners, if you're not aware of that, please do subscribe. We have tiers for everybody. But the top two tiers of this include access to what we refer to as the Légion de Scholeur, as opposed to the Légion d'honneur. And this is a bi-monthly, every 2 months, seminar, basically, run by Zach and myself, where we talk through an article or a chapter or something like that. It's for people who apparently hate themselves so much they pay extra to listen to us even more. We're doing an article on the Royal Navy this month, and it's from the 70s, and we wanted to sort of show how far the discourse had come. And so I said to Zach, why don't we do one of Seth's articles for the next one? And so, in a first for the podcast, we want to give you, the author, a choice between Buggery's Travels, Royal Navy Sodomy on Ship and Shore in the Long 18th Century, and Oh My Poor Arse, My Arse Can Best Tell, Surgeons, Ordinary Witnesses, and the Sodomitical Body in Georgian Britain. Which would you which one do you want us to talk about? Which are you prouder of? Which is more interesting? Any value system you want to put on this, but we want to give you the choice.
This is wonderful. I've never gotten a question like this before. This is really interesting. Is the article you're giving that old Arthur Gilbert article um, from the 70s?
No.
Okay,
Well, there are reasons why we'll keep the author nameless, but
absolutely.
I had so there was a very specific agenda behind this month's Legion de Scholar, which was to really a lot of my teaching practice comes from being a secondary school teacher, and so all of my
Right,
research, all of my teaching work has a skills undercurrent that kind of it is baked into the knowledge
right.
kind of thrust behind it. So I wanted the folks in our course to get used to the idea of really picking apart what historians said. So I've given them an article that has questionable elements to it in many ways, in
Okay,
order to make it easy for them to take that apart. So, as Luke kind of alludes to, this follow-up session in 2 months' time is the counterpoint to that. You know, taking a really strong piece of research and going, okay, you had a go at taking something apart that had obvious problems with it. Now let's start to critically look at something that's much better in terms of its quality. So I'm not going to mention the author for obvious reasons, but
absolutely fair. Yeah, I understand. Okay, yeah, I would. I'm conflicted. I have a real soft spot in my article, in my heart for the poor arse article. I'm a historian of medicine as well, and that's my primary training actually. And I I love that I was able to put out a forensics of buggery article, and I won an award for it too. So I don't know if my mother is proud exactly, but I'm award-winning buggery forensics historian now. I think I would pick the other one though, the Buggery's Travels one. That's more directly focused on the Navy. It's an early report of this research, but I'm proud of the research in there, and I think that I think it made some really useful interventions, and I've been gratified to see some people cite it as a kind of scene-setting article when doing work in other areas as well. So I had hoped that it would work in that way, and thinking as a teacher, I think that that would be the one I would choose if I were you. So that'd be my pick. But I like the other one. Feel free to circulate that to them as well. The poor arse one, I like to give a warning to people when I'm talking about that material because I think some of the content is a bit extreme as well. Even people who are interested in queer history, the medical history aspect of that can be a bit disturbing.
yeah, that's quite often the
Well,
case with medical
yeah,
stuff, isn't it?
it
That, you know,
That's what
it
I've
ends
found.
up
Yeah.
being I mean, I'm very mindful of the interviews we've done with Mick Crumplin about surgery, and it's always very interesting when somebody with medical training comes into the chat because they have a very different perspective. It's so much more um, quite often the approach is much more matter of fact because there is this sort of, particularly with in Mick's case, you know, he's a former surgeon, so he's very used to talking about these things. So there we have it. We will take your recommendation on that. And
Oh,
folks,
awesome.
if you are interested in the Legion d'Escola, apologies for the long-winded, fundamentally ad that we've just subjected you to. Um, it is open to all, regardless of any level of historical expertise that you may have, even if you dropped history at high school, or secondary school, as we refer to it on this side of the Atlantic. we make sure that these things are accessible to people. All you need is enthusiasm. So it's not the
Mhm.
case that you need to have done the university style thing. And in fact, the whole point behind it is to give you a taste and a route into some of the kind of stuff that we get the fun of talking about and discussing and put you at the heart of the learning process. So it's very much designed to be a supportive rather than a sort of a case of myself and Luke kind of lecturing you guys. If you are interested, please check out our Patreon page. We, as ever, have a link in the description. And if you look at the price tag and think, I'm not so sure about that, bear in mind that each perk is kind of viable in its own right. So we can actually enroll you on a lower kind of custom perk thing where you don't necessarily get all of the perks of Legion to Scholar, which is kind of cumulative. So you get things like green room access and access to the meet the author experience and all the other
Mhm.
things. We can kind of take those out and fundamentally charge you at a lower price if it's beyond your price tag. So there you go. That is my sales pitch for the day.
Yeah, and I will say, modestly, I think both Zach and I are spectacular lecturers. But Zach is a truly brilliant seminar leader. It's the secondary training. It's something that I need to learn how to do better, and watching him is really inspirational. So it is very much worth it. And also, I would say, if you are an undergraduate or an MA student, and you are curious to feel what a day in a PhD feels like, get in contact with us because I think it's a good sort of test case for that. All right. So, Seth, thank you so much for coming on. I'm afraid that unless you basically block our emails, you will be hearing from us again. We want you back on here because some of our listeners, most of our listeners are spectacular, but some of our listeners seem to forget that women exist. So if we can remind them that queer women exist and that queer people exist in general, we will do our very best to. So we'd love to have you back on, but thank you so much for coming on and putting up with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's not putting up at all. This was such a delight, and yes, please invite me back many times. I would love to join you all again.
We will definitely have you back. So this is the first but not the last time that you will hear from Seth Le Jacq, assistant professor of history at Hunter College, which is part of the City University of New York. I have a master's from Hunter as well, and I forgot to mention that it's CUNY at the beginning. So we really should have mentioned that part of that skill in lecturing comes from teaching there for over a decade. It's got a very soft spot in my heart. But we will be there's more coming. We're Zach and I are off to talk about the other naval article now. We've got Legion de Scholar in exactly 20 minutes, so we need to go. But there's so much coming up on the podcast, on our YouTube channel. At some point soon, you're going to see Josh, our quiet, reserved undergraduate, learn to load and fire a musket, which is going to be spectacular. So Seth, to give you some background, one of our other members, Liam Telfer, our esteemed quartermaster, is a former corporal of horse of His Majesty's Heavy Cavalry, and he's also a fully trained firefighter. He went from the Heavy Cavalry to the Fire Brigade. But he's got all of the explosives training and all the firearms training, and he lives on a farm. And what he wants to do is take a series of august historians and see how quickly he can teach them to load and fire a Brown Bess musket. It's a sort of historical version of, I don't know if you're familiar with Top Gear, but a star in a reasonably priced car. It's going to be historian with a reproduction musket. And we're going to have a leaderboard and everything. So Zach's been through the gauntlet already. Josh is next. I will be either in April or June when I'm over. And if you're ever in the United Kingdom, let us know and you can shoot some stuff. Uh,
You have sold me. Next time I'm over there for a research trip, I want to fire a musket too.
Excellent. All right. So we have so much to come. So please enjoy. Leave us a rating if you haven't. Subscribe if you haven't. Our Patreon is always open. Be well, and as always, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. And yes, that remains a threat. Good night.
Folks, do me a favor. Go and review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment, crucially. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the most powerful thing you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people subscriptions to the Patreon perks we offer? So, if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/napwarspod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, book clubs, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much, much more. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month. So if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-January 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, Daniel Friedman, and Jonathan Willets. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.